The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, a low hum of disbelief rippling through the air. Judge Richard Calloway leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze fixed on the teenage girl standing at the defendant's table. He adjusted his glasses and let out a slow, exaggerated sigh before speaking, his voice thick with condescension. "Miss Sullivan, do you even know where you are?" His tone was sharp, cutting through the tense silence like a knife. "This is a court of law, not a playground for wannabe attorneys." A few chuckles echoed from the attorneys seated behind their polished wooden desks. Charlotte Sullivan stood firm, gripping a heavy stack of legal documents in her arms. Just 17, with messy curls barely tamed by a loose ponytail and oversized glasses sliding down her nose, she hardly fit the image of a competent lawyer. The simple sweater and scuffed sneakers only cemented the impression. She was out of place, a child playing dress-up in a world meant for seasoned professionals. The laughter in the courtroom grew louder, attorneys exchanging amused glances as if the very idea of her standing there was a joke. But Charlotte didn't flinch. She adjusted her glasses, squared her shoulders, and met Judge Calloway's skeptical glare with unwavering confidence. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, deliberate. "I am fully aware of where I am, and I intend to prove that I belong here." The courtroom quieted. The judge raised an eyebrow, amused but unimpressed. "Is that so?" He smirked. "And just what makes you think you have the right to stand in this courtroom, let alone represent a defendant?" Charlotte lifted the documents in her hands. "The law, Your Honor." The room erupted in laughter again. Judge Calloway shook his head, already preparing to dismiss her, but then he hesitated. There was something in her stance, in the way she refused to be rattled. For the first time, he actually studied her. Was this just arrogance? Or was there something more? Now, here's the real question. Will Charlotte prove everyone wrong? Or is she about to make a complete fool of herself in front of the entire courtroom? What do you think? Would you trust her to handle your case? Comment below, yes, bar1, or no, bar2. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge everything you think you know about justice. 2 weeks earlier, in a cramped New York apartment, Charlotte Sullivan sat hunched over a desk, cluttered with law books, court transcripts, and yellow legal pads covered in frantic notes. The glow of a desk lamp cast deep shadows across her tired face as she flipped through a thick case file, her eyes scanning every word with unwavering focus. The books weren't hers. They had belonged to her older brother, Michael, who had once dreamed of becoming a lawyer before everything fell apart. Michael had been on the cusp of taking the bar exam when his world came crashing down. One accusation, one powerful man with the right connections, and suddenly his entire future had been ripped away. He had been convicted of a crime he didn't commit, sentenced to years behind bars, while Charlotte and her family watched helplessly. The injustice of it burned inside her like a fire that refused to die. Across the small apartment, Lisa, Charlotte's best friend since middle school, lounged on the couch with a bag of potato chips, watching Charlotte with a mix of amusement and concern. "Why are you doing this, Charlotte?" Lisa asked, crunching loudly. "You're 17. You're not a lawyer." Charlotte didn't look up. She just kept reading, flipping through another page in the case file. Lisa sighed, setting the bag of chips down. "Seriously, you barely sleep. You barely eat. You keep skipping school." "I study," Charlotte corrected. Lisa rolled her eyes. "Yeah, that's exactly my point. You're acting like you're preparing for a case or something." At that, Charlotte finally lifted her head. She pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose and met Lisa's gaze with a look so intense, so unwavering, that it sent a chill down Lisa's spine. "I am." Lisa blinked. "Wait. What?" Charlotte took a deep breath, closing the case. file carefully, as if the very pages held something sacred. I've spent the last year reading every law book I could find. I know how the system works, how it's supposed to work, and I know when it's being used to crush people who can't fight back. Lisa's voice softened. Charlotte swallowed hard, gripping the file as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. Because Michael believed in justice, and if no one else will fight for him, I will. Silence stretched between them. Lisa had always known Charlotte was stubborn, but this was different. After a long pause, Lisa sighed and crossed her arms. You're insane, you know that. Charlotte let out a small, tired laugh. Yeah, I've been told. Lisa hesitated, then reached for another chip. Okay. So, let's say you somehow pull this off. What happens if the court laughs you out of the room? What happens if you fail? Charlotte's jaw clenched. She already knew the answer. If she failed, it wouldn't just be embarrassing. It would confirm everything the world already believed, that she was just a kid, that Michael was just another statistic, and that justice was nothing more than a fantasy for people without power. But she refused to accept that. She looked back down at the case file, running her fingers over the pages. I can't fail. Lisa watched her for a long moment, then sighed. Okay, fine. Let's say you're actually serious about this. What's the plan? Charlotte exhaled slowly, flipping open the case file once more. First, I prove I belong in that courtroom. Then, I prove that Michael never should have been in prison in the first place. Lisa shook her head, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. You really don't know how to back down, do you? Charlotte smirked. Not even a little. Outside the apartment window, the city pulsed with life, oblivious to the storm Charlotte was preparing to unleash. She had no law degree, no formal training, and no one backing her, but she had something stronger. She had the truth, and she was ready to fight for it. The laughter in the courtroom had died down, replaced by an eerie silence. The attorneys who had been smirking only moments before were now hunched over their legal pads, scribbling notes furiously, their eyes darting between Sullivan and the judge. Charlotte stood tall at the defendant's table, her fingers gripping the edges of the stack of documents she had spent months preparing. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let it show. Every second counted. Every word mattered. Across from her, Judge Richard Calloway leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Miss Sullivan, he said, his voice carrying an unmistakable edge. You seem very confident for someone with no legal credentials. Charlotte met his gaze without flinching. Confidence has nothing to do with it, Your Honor, she replied evenly. What matters is the law. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line, and he gestured toward the papers in her hands. Then, by all means, enlighten us. Charlotte took a steadying breath. Your Honor, the prosecution claims that my client, Mr. Patrick Monroe, embezzled over $500,000 from his employer. Their entire case hinges on a single set of financial records, documents that I have here. She tapped the top page of the file, but these records don't tell the whole story. The prosecuting attorney, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a tailored suit, let out a scoff. And I suppose you think you've found something all of us missed? Charlotte turned her gaze toward him, unshaken. Yes, Mr. Reynolds, I do. She walked toward the bench, handing a copy of the records to the judge. On the surface, these transactions appear to show Mr. Monroe shifting funds between accounts. However, if you compare these to the company's internal logs, she held up another set of documents. You'll notice discrepancies in the timestamps. These so-called transfers were actually processed after my client was already terminated from the company. The judge flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing. Reynolds cleared his throat, clearly rattled. That's circumstantial at best. A clerical error doesn't prove innocence. Charlotte didn't blink. I agree. That's why I cross-referenced the data with federal banking logs. These transactions were manually entered by someone with full system access. My client never had that level of clearance. The silence in the courtroom deepened. Judge Calloway set the documents down slowly. His face, once amused, was now unreadable. "And where exactly did you study law, Miss Sullivan?" Charlotte held her ground, her voice unwavering. "I didn't go to law school. I studied everything I could because I had to." A hushed gasp traveled through the audience. The judge's fingers drummed against the bench. "And yet, here you are, citing case law, analyzing financial discrepancies, and presenting a defense with more coherence than half the attorneys I see in this courtroom." Charlotte lifted her chin. "Because my client deserves a fair trial. Isn't that what the law is supposed to ensure?" Reynolds clenched his jaw. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. A teenager is not qualified to practice law." Charlotte turned toward him sharply. "Then refute my argument, Mr. Reynolds. Show me where I'm wrong." Reynolds opened his mouth, then closed it. Judge Calloway exhaled, rubbing his temple. "I'll allow the defense to proceed, for now." Charlotte let out a slow breath, but she knew better than to celebrate yet. This was just the beginning. Could you handle yourself in a courtroom without formal training? Let us know in the comments below. The courtroom doors burst open, the sudden noise cutting through the tense silence like a blade. All heads turned as a tall man in a perfectly pressed navy suit strode in, his polished leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. He carried a sleek briefcase in one hand and an air of authority in the other. Judge Calloway's eyes narrowed. "And who exactly do you think you are, barging into my courtroom unannounced?" The man barely spared a glance at the judge before shifting his gaze to Charlotte. "David Harrington, Your Honor. I represent the American Bar Association." A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience like wildfire. Charlotte's stomach tightened, but she kept her face neutral. Harrington snapped open his briefcase, retrieving a crisp document. "I am here to formally notify the court that Miss Sullivan is in direct violation of legal statutes regarding the unauthorized practice of law." His voice was smooth, precise, calculated. Judge Calloway let out a heavy sigh. "And what exactly do you expect me to do with this information, Mr. Harrington?" Harrington turned toward Charlotte with the kind of look a predator might give its cornered prey. "Miss Sullivan has not attended law school, has not passed the bar, and is therefore wholly unqualified to be presenting arguments in a court of law. If she continues, not only will her statements carry no legal weight, but she may also be subject to criminal charges herself." Gasps rang out through the courtroom. Even Reynolds, the prosecuting attorney, looked surprised. Charlotte swallowed hard. She had expected pushback, but not this quickly. Judge Calloway leaned back in his chair, considering. "Well, Miss Sullivan, what do you have to say about that?" Charlotte straightened her spine, keeping her voice steady. "I say that my client deserves a fair trial." Harrington's expression remained unreadable. "Justice cannot come at the expense of the law." Charlotte clenched her fists. "Then what is the law for?" A flicker of amusement crossed the judge's face, but he remained silent, letting her continue. Charlotte stepped forward, her voice growing stronger. "If the law exists to protect the innocent, then why is it being used as a weapon against me for simply defending someone who has no other options? Should we let my client be convicted just because I don't have the right paperwork?" Harrington's lips pressed into a thin line. "You may think you're doing the right thing, Miss Sullivan, but rules exist for a reason. If we allow just anyone to practice law, we invite chaos into the justice system." Charlotte didn't flinch. "Respectfully, sir, there's already chaos in the justice system. Innocent people go to prison every day because they don't have the money for a decent defense. What I'm doing here isn't the problem, it's the proof that the system is failing. The murmurs in the audience grew louder, heads nodding, people whispering. Charlotte could feel the tide turning. Judge Calloway drummed his fingers against the bench. A compelling argument, but it doesn't change the fact that you're not a licensed attorney. Charlotte took a deep breath. Then let me prove I belong here. The judge raised an eyebrow. You're asking me to ignore the law? I'm asking you to uphold it, she countered. I may not have a degree, but I have done the work. I know this case better than anyone in this room, and I can prove my client's innocence. A long silence stretched across the courtroom. Harrington, for the first time, looked uncertain. Judge Calloway exhaled sharply. Miss Sullivan, I'll allow you to continue for now. But I want it understood that this is highly irregular, and if you waste this court's time, there will be consequences. Charlotte nodded. Understood, Your Honor. She turned back toward her client, determination burning in her chest. The system was against her, but she wasn't backing down. The courtroom's heavy wooden doors slammed open with a thunderous bang, cutting through the tense silence like a blade. Every head in the room turned sharply toward the entrance as a man, out of breath and gripping a USB drive tightly in his fist, stumbled into the chamber. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. The man's suit was rumpled, his hair disheveled, but there was something undeniable about the urgency in his eyes. He looked straight at her, then turned to the judge. Your Honor, he gasped, his voice shaking but determined. This trial is built on a lie, and I have the proof right here. Murmurs erupted through the courtroom, a ripple of confusion and shock spreading like wildfire. Judge Calloway's gavel came down, sharp and commanding. Identify yourself at once. The man straightened his tie, still catching his breath. My name is Edward Blake. I worked in the financial department at Whitmore Industries, the company accusing Mr. Langley of embezzlement. And I can prove that this entire case is a setup. At the defense table, Charlotte could feel the sudden shift in energy, like a dam that had been threatening to burst finally cracking open. The prosecutor, David Reynolds, shot up from his seat. This is outrageous, Your Honor. This man is not a listed witness, and we have no evidence that— Enough. Judge Calloway's steely gaze silenced the room. He turned to Blake. If you're making these claims, you'd better have something concrete to back them up. Blake nodded firmly. I do, Your Honor. This USB contains internal records, financial transactions, and emails. It proves that Douglas Shaw, the prosecution's key witness, is not just lying. He's the one who actually stole the money and framed Mr. Langley to cover his tracks. Gasps filled the room. Charlotte clutched the edge of the defense table, her pulse racing. This was it. Across the courtroom, Douglas Shaw's face turned an alarming shade of white. The man who had confidently testified just hours earlier about Langley's so-called suspicious activities now looked like a cornered rat. Reynolds scrambled for control. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This so-called evidence has not been verified, and I refuse to— You refuse? Calloway cut in, his tone like ice. Counselor, I will be the one to determine what's valid in my courtroom. Bailiff, take the drive. The USB was handed over to the court's IT specialist, who plugged it into a laptop connected to the projector. The entire room held its breath. Charlotte leaned in, her heart pounding. If this was what she thought it was, she might actually be able to win this case. A series of emails appeared on the large screen. The courtroom watched as Blake's evidence unfolded in real time. Shaw's name was everywhere. In one email, he requested fund transfers from a private account. Another showed a desperate message to an unnamed executive. We need to pin this on someone else. If Langley takes the fall, we're safe. A wave of horrified whispers filled the room. Judge Calloway's brow furrowed deeper as he flipped through the files. His expression turned from skepticism to grave concern. Charlotte took a slow breath. Then she turned to the stunned prosecutor. Mr. Reynolds, she said coolly. "I think your star witness has some explaining to do." Douglas Shaw shot to his feet. "This is a setup. This is fake. They're trying to destroy my reputation. Sit down, Mr. Shaw." Judge Calloway's voice thundered across the room. The weight of the moment hung in the air. Charlotte could feel the entire courtroom leaning in, waiting. Finally, Calloway turned to Reynolds. "Counselor, do you have an explanation?" The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, but it was clear from his expression that he was cornered. There was no spinning this. I need time to review." "This information, Your Honor," Reynolds said through gritted teeth. Calloway tapped his gavel. "You'll get your time. But as of now, Mr. Langley's charges are under immediate review." A wave of relief crashed over Charlotte. She had done it. Calloway sighed, rubbing his temples. Then he turned his gaze to Charlotte. "Young lady," he said, "I'll give you this. You've proven yourself more than I expected. But that doesn't change the fact that you are not a licensed attorney." Charlotte held her ground, despite the lump forming in her throat. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "everything I have done today has been in service of the truth. Isn't that what the law is supposed to be about?" The judge studied her, his sharp eyes narrowing. The courtroom waited in tense silence. Finally, he sighed, shaking his head. "Against my better judgment, I'll allow you to continue, for now." A collective gasp rippled through the spectators. Charlotte exhaled slowly, steadying herself. This fight was far from over, but she had just won a major battle. As the courtroom buzzed with murmurs, Judge Calloway's voice cut through once more. "Court will reconvene in 1 hour," he announced, "and we will get to the bottom of this." Charlotte sat back in her chair, heart still pounding. But just as she allowed herself a sliver of relief, she noticed something. Reynolds, the prosecutor, had turned away, whispering something into his phone, his expression dark and urgent. Cold chill ran down her spine. Something told her that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. If you were the judge, what would you do? Drop no. 1 to let Charlotte continue, or number 2 to shut it down? Let's discuss in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge everything you think you know about justice. This segment intensifies the drama, exposes corruption, and gives Charlotte a hard-earned but temporary victory, while teasing the danger ahead. Let me know if you'd like any refinements before we move to the next section. Charlotte climbed the stairs to her apartment. Exhausted but exhilarated, the courtroom battle had taken everything out of her, but for the first time she felt like she had a real shot at exposing the truth. The door to her apartment stood slightly ajar. She froze, her breath hitched as she stared at the gap, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had locked that door before leaving. She was sure of it. A warning bell screamed in her mind. Slowly, she reached for the doorknob and pushed it open. The moment she stepped inside, her stomach dropped. Her apartment had been ransacked. The small living room was a mess, her couch cushions slashed open, her bookshelf emptied, the contents of her drawers dumped onto the floor. The air smelled faintly of sweat and metal, as if someone had been lurking here for a while. Her chest tightened. This wasn't random. Someone had been looking for something. She took a cautious step forward, her shoes crunching over the broken glass of a shattered lamp. Her heart pounded in her ears as she took in the wreckage, and then she saw it. A single sheet of white paper sat on the kitchen counter. The words were written in thick, black ink, scrawled in harsh, jagged letters. "Stop digging, or else." Charlotte's hands shook as she picked up the note. She forced herself to take a deep breath, but her fingers trembled as she ran them over the rough paper. This was a message, a warning. She swallowed hard, her pulse thrumming in her throat. Whoever had sent this knew what she was doing. They were watching. She knew she should be scared. Any reasonable person would take the warning for what it was and back off. But instead of fear, something else burned in her chest. Rage. How dare they? How dare they break into her home like she was some kind of weak, frightened girl who could be bullied into silence? Her mind flashed back to the courtroom, to the way Douglas Shaw's face had drained of color when the evidence came to light. Someone had a lot to lose if she kept going. That meant she was getting too close to the truth. And that meant she couldn't. Stop now. Her jaw clenched. Fine. If they thought she was going to back down, they had no idea who they were dealing with. She reached for her phone, hands still shaking, and dialed Lisa's number. Her best friend answered on the third ring, her voice groggy. "Charlotte, it's almost midnight. What's—" They broke into my apartment. Lisa's voice sharpened instantly. "What? Are you hurt? Where are you now?" "I just got home." "They trashed the place," Charlotte said, pacing the room, running a hand through her curls. "They left a note. Told me to stop digging." Lisa swore. "Oh my God, this is serious, Char. You need to call the police." Charlotte hesitated. Did she? The police should have been her first call, but something in her gut twisted at the thought. This case wasn't just some small-time fraud. It involved powerful people, people with money, influence, connections. Could she really trust the police to take this seriously? Or worse, what if someone in law enforcement was in on it? Lisa sighed on the other end of the line. "You're thinking about not calling them, aren't you?" Charlotte pinched the bridge of her nose. "Lisa, what if this goes higher than we think?" A heavy silence stretched between them. Then Lisa spoke, her voice low and serious. "Okay, then you can't stay there. Pack a bag. You're coming to my place." Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment, then nodded, even though Lisa couldn't see her. "Yeah, okay." Her friend was right. Staying here wasn't just dangerous, it was stupid. 15 minutes later, Charlotte shoved a duffel bag over her shoulder and took one last glance at her apartment. A place that had once been her sanctuary was now nothing more than a crime scene. She flicked off the light and locked the door behind her, double-checking even though she knew it was pointless. The damage was already done. By the time she arrived at Lisa's apartment, her body was buzzing with exhaustion, but her mind wouldn't stop spinning. She lay on Lisa's couch, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts a tangled mess. Was this just a scare tactic, or was she really in danger? And more importantly, how far were they willing to go to shut her up? Her eyes flickered over to her duffel bag. Inside, her brother's old law books sat at the top, the pages worn from months of flipping through them. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about Michael. He had believed in justice, in doing the right thing, even when the odds were against him. Charlotte owed it to him, to every innocent person who had ever been railroaded by the system, to see this through. No matter what it cost her, she finally drifted off to sleep. But her dreams were filled with shadows and whispers. Somewhere in the distance she heard the sound of a gavel striking wood. The trial wasn't over, and neither was the fight. Would you walk away, or would you keep fighting? Drop number 1 to fight back, or number 2 if you think Charlotte should walk away for her own safety. Let's discuss in the comments, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you want to see justice served. Charlotte woke up to the faint hum of traffic outside Lisa's apartment, her body stiff from a restless night on the couch. The events of the previous evening played in her head like a broken record. The break-in, the note, the fear gnawing. At the edge of her determination, she reached for her phone, checking the time. 6:04 a.m. No new messages, no calls, but she knew better than to assume things had quieted down. Lisa walked into the living room, still in her pajamas, clutching a steaming mug of coffee. Her face was set in an expression Charlotte had seen before, the one she wore whenever she was about to say something Charlotte wouldn't like. "You're still going through with this, aren't you?" Lisa asked, handing Charlotte a mug of her own. Charlotte wrapped her fingers around the warm ceramic, letting the heat ground her. I don't have a choice, Lisa sighed, running a hand through her sleep-mussed hair. You do have a choice, Char. You could just walk away. Charlotte looked at her friend, really looked at her. Lisa wasn't saying this because she doubted her. She was saying it because she was scared for her, and maybe, Charlotte thought, she had every reason to be. Walking away won't make me safer, Charlotte said quietly. They broke into my apartment because I'm getting too close. If I stop now, they win. Lisa exhaled sharply, rubbing at her temples. Then at least be smart about it. No more lone wolf moves. You need help. Charlotte thought about that. She hated depending on people, hated feeling like she was dragging others into danger. But Lisa wasn't wrong. She couldn't do this alone. Fine, Charlotte said, setting down her mug. But I don't know who to trust. Lisa tilted her head, considering. What about that guy? The one who crashed the courtroom with the USB? Charlotte frowned. Henry Dalton? Lisa snapped. Her fingers. Yeah, him. He had proof. He came forward knowing the risks. Charlotte leaned back against the couch, chewing on the thought. Henry had seemed genuinely nervous when he stepped into that courtroom, but he also hadn't hesitated. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her recent calls. His number wasn't saved, but she still had the unknown contact from yesterday. It had to be him. She hesitated for half a second, then pressed dial. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered. Who is this? Henry, it's Charlotte. Sullivan. Silence. Then a shaky exhale. You shouldn't be calling me. Charlotte's stomach tightened. They got to you, didn't they? More silence. Then his voice dropped to a whisper. I can't talk right now. Charlotte's grip on the phone tightened. Henry, listen to me. They broke into my apartment last night. They're trying to scare me off the case. Henry cursed under his breath. Then you need to back off. I can't. A beat. Then a resigned sigh. Meet me at 8th Street Cafe in an hour, Henry said. If you're serious about this, I'll tell you everything I know. Charlotte arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early, scanning the room for any sign of suspicious activity. The cafe itself was a hole-in-the-wall kind of place, mostly empty at this time of morning. A few older men nursed black coffee in the corner, flipping through newspapers. A waitress leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone, and then, in the back booth, she saw him, Henry Dalton. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his fingers twitching slightly as he drummed them against the tabletop. Charlotte slid into the seat across from him. You look like hell, she said. Henry let out a humorless laugh. Yeah, well, that's what happens when you go up against people who make people disappear. Charlotte stiffened. Disappear? Henry rubbed a hand over his face. You think this is just about your brother's case? It's bigger than that. Charlotte leaned in. Then tell me everything. Henry glanced around, checking for eavesdroppers. Then he lowered his voice. The prosecution's key witness, Douglas Shaw. Charlotte nodded. He's dirty, Henry said. And not just in this case. He's been planting evidence for years, working with some very powerful people to protect their interests. Charlotte's pulse kicked up. Who? Henry hesitated. Then he pulled out a folded piece of paper and slid it across the table. Charlotte unfolded it. There were names, dates, dollar amounts, and at the bottom, one name stood out above the rest. Charlotte's stomach dropped. The same man who had nearly laughed her out of court, the man ruling over her case. He was in on it. Her hands clenched into fists. Henry's voice was grim. Now you get why they broke into your apartment. why they want you to stop. Charlotte's mind raced. The judge himself was compromised, which meant she was walking into a rigged fight. The trial wasn't about justice. It was about protecting their secrets. She swallowed hard. If Calloway is in on this, how do we win? Henry met her gaze, his expression serious. We don't just fight the case, he said. We take down the entire system. Charlotte walked out of the cafe an hour later, her heart pounding. The truth was so much bigger than she had imagined. Her brother's conviction, Mr. Peterson's trial. It was all connected. And the people pulling the strings, they were willing to do anything to keep their power. She pulled out her phone and dialed Lisa. We're going to need help, she said. Lisa exhaled sharply. How much trouble are we in? Charlotte looked back at the cafe, watching as Henry Dalton disappeared into the crowd. More than we ever imagined. If you found out a judge was involved in a major cover-up, would you drop number 1 to go public with the information immediately? Drop number 2 to gather more evidence before making a move? Let's discuss in the comments. And if you're ready to see how deep this conspiracy goes, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Charlotte stood outside the courthouse, the cool autumn air crisp against her skin. The weight of everything she had fought for, everything she had risked, settled in her chest like a quiet storm. But this time, it wasn't fear or anger fueling her. It was relief. Michael was free. She turned just as the heavy courthouse doors swung open, and there he was, her brother, stepping into the sunlight for the first time in 3 long years. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, Michael's face broke into a disbelieving smile, and Charlotte ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. I told you I'd fix this, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Michael laughed, his grip tightening around her. Yeah, well, I was starting to think you were crazier than I was. Charlotte pulled back, wiping at her eyes, shaking her head. You have no idea what I had to go through. Michael arched an eyebrow. Oh, I have a feeling I'll be hearing about it for a long, long time. They both laughed, the tension of the past finally breaking, but even as Charlotte stood there basking in the moment, she knew this was just the beginning. Later that night, she sat across from Lisa and Henry at their favorite diner. The battle was over, but there was still so much work to be done. Henry took a sip of his coffee, watching her carefully. So what's next, Sullivan? You taking a break? Maybe, I don't know, enjoying being a teenager for once? Charlotte smirked. Not exactly, Lisa groaned. Of course not. Charlotte leaned forward, her eyes alight with something new. One day, she said, grinning. I'll be back in that courtroom, but next time I won't be fighting my way in. I'll be walking in as a real lawyer. Lisa's jaw dropped. Wait, are you serious? Henry chuckled. Of course she is. You think she'd go through all this and not turn it into a career? Charlotte tapped the table, thinking about everything that had led her here. The injustice, the corruption, the people who had been willing to throw innocent lives away to protect themselves. She had seen firsthand how the system could be weaponized against the powerless, and she wasn't about to sit on the sidelines and let it happen again. Michael had believed in justice, and now so did she. Lisa shook her head in disbelief but grinned. Well, remind me to never bet against you. Charlotte laughed, her heart lighter than it had been in years. This wasn't the end, this was just the beginning. Do you think Charlotte should become a real lawyer? If so, hit that like button and subscribe. And if you want to see what happens next, drop a comment saying Part 2.